enjoy talking to you and seeing what you guys are doing.
Excellent. Good to have you with us. And of course, on the other end, we have Brian Forrester with us. Welcome, Brian. How are you today?
Very good. Thank you very much, Henrik.
So you're joining us from, are you down in Peru right now?
Yeah, I'm in Lima.
Wow, excellent. How's the weather down there today?
It's about 18 degrees Celsius and overcast, but this is supposedly winter here, so that's fine with me since I'm from Canada.
That sounds good. Okay, excellent. So we're obviously going to talk a little bit about, you guys have a tour upcoming here in November together with Hugh Newman from Megalithomania, some of the tours of South America around there. And both of you guys obviously are together working on a book project about the elongated skulls, very strange phenomena. Why don't we begin to just talk a little bit about the collaboration here in the beginning? David, you have written, obviously, as I mentioned before, a little bit about some of the different mysteries around the world, the mystery of the Olmecs, the technology of the gods and so forth as well, and before that as well, you wrote about the crystal skull. So for you, from your perspective, this is not that much of a leap, if you know what I mean, David, right?
Yeah, right, Henrik. And in fact, in a lot of my books, my Lost Cities books, and in the mystery of the Olmecs, I do discuss cranial deformation, these strange elongated skulls, and they're found all over the world, including remote islands, in South America, in Central America with the Olmecs, even up in Canada, and of course in Iraq and Malta, Vanuatu. The ancient Egyptians did it. It was a worldwide and strange phenomenon.
And Brian, you've been doing tours of the Inca Empire, of course, as well. When did you get into the idea of elongated skulls? And so tell us a bit about that, Brian.
Well, basically, it was when I was writing my first book, A Brief History of the Incas, and there's a very strong correlation or connection between the Inca and Tiwanaku in Bolivia. It's believed that the Inca came from there. There's a small museum in the basement of the Coricancha, which is the spiritual center of Cusco, and there they have elongated skulls on display, which state that they're Inca. So from there I thought, well, I've heard that the Inca were a special, group of people or sub-race, so I traced them back to Tiwanaku, and there again you have the elongated skulls, and so I thought, well, there must be possibly a genetic component to it. But it's mainly on the geographic area of Paracas, Peru. The largest skulls in the world are found, and it was from a tip that David gave me to go to the Ica Regional Museum, which is in the area, and that's where these absolutely huge ones are, which have a number of anatomical differences to average human beings.
Interesting. So obviously there's a lot of different cranial deformations, versions of this out there. People have, in the ancient world, used planks, obviously, and different things tied together around their skull to make it in this shape so that it grows elongated in that way. But we have other weird phenomena out there as well. I know that both of you guys are obviously familiar with the work of Lloyd Pye, and we had him with us recently talking about the Star Child skull, and he's now been doing some DNA tests on this and to try to pin down the origin of this as well. But David, this is something that you're looking at as well now in your recent work, your collaboration here together of actually doing some DNA work on these skulls, correct?
Yes, I mean, that's right. And Brian is the one who's really pushing that one, and I'm hoping that he'll be able to have some genetic material from some of these Paracas and Ica skulls in Peru tested, and isn't Lloyd Pye helping you do that, right, Brian?
Yeah, actually, I sent Lloyd 10 samples from 5 different skulls. Some of them seem to be elongated based upon cranial manipulation, but 2 of them seem to be natural, and again, that's based on at least 5 anatomical characteristics, which Lloyd actually pointed out. So, yeah, he and I are in contact every couple of days. He's got the samples. They've been delivered to his geneticist in Texas, and his geneticist is finishing off a special little lab right now, which should take another couple of weeks to ensure that no external DNA comes in to contaminate the samples. But fortunately, Lloyd is just like over the moon about the fact that I was able to get these samples to him, and he's quite confident that he and his geneticist will find that these are not simply manipulated elongated heads, but they suspect that there's some other genetic component, possibly, as strange as it may sound, not from this world.
What do you think that we might be able to find there, or what you guys will be able to find? How weird can it get? I mean, again, Lloyd's work, he's obviously looking as the source here, if you will, of the Star Child skull as being extraterrestrial. Do you think that we might be looking at a similar thing, that these might actually be, in some way or another, be able to compare these different skulls? Brian, what do you think?
Well, I really don't, I actually come from a scientific background, so I don't like to speculate too much, but, the little that I will speculate on this topic is that it seems that the elongated skulls, the natural ones, which are found around Ica and Paracas, which date back at least 3,000, if not more like 6,000 or 7,000 years, they could have a genetic component from possibly Sirius or the Pleiades star system, as odd as that sounds.
How so? Why these places, do you think?
Because in terms of the oral traditions, that's where oral traditions point in that area to there having been so-called gods from Sirius and or the Pleiades that interacted with people. And so interaction could very well mean not just a meet and greet situation, but an actual blending of genetic material.
Interesting. And David, obviously you brought up that these skulls are found in different cultures from around the world, different weird anomalies in that way. And I think it's quite sensible to argue, obviously, that they might have gotten the inspiration to do these deformations. If we look at them from that point of view, that they might be, they're still natural, human skulls, if you will, in that sense, but they have maybe tried to emulate or copy somebody, looking up to somebody, right? What do you think, David?
Well, right. I mean, it's a baffling enigma, as it is, why people were doing the cranial deformation. I mean, we know that at least some of these people had normal skulls in the sense of what we think of today and what most human beings have, and that they were using head binding cradles and some kind of pressure or something to deform the skull, to elongate it. And people were doing this all over the world. Now, whether they were doing it to imitate some kind of extraterrestrials who just naturally look like this without any head binding, or whether this was just something that ancient peoples did, particularly aristocrats and special pharaohs and kings. It's been thought, actually, that most people who have some kind of cranial deformation are part of this special aristocratic class. But the question is, as Brian's bringing up, is whether some of these skulls are naturally elongated without the head binding. And then you might speculate then that, yeah, these are extraterrestrials and things like that. But I was wondering, Brian, too, I mean, even if a person's skull was genetically already encoded to become elongated, and that's totally, entirely possible, and you have to wonder if certain ancient humans who may have had some connection to extraterrestrials or something, but even they would have had to be infants at one time, and they would have plates in their head that would also grow and fuse and create an elongated head. Whether and this is without head binding. There's just the normal genetic material is creating this shape rather than artificially doing it. But you would still have plates in your head to fuse, even if it was a natural thing, right, Brian?
Well, that's true, and that's one of the characteristics which is intriguing, is that every human being, as far as we know on the Earth, have three major plates. There's the frontal plate, and then behind that there are what are called the parietal plates, and there are two of them that come together. So you have the three of them that grow together and then fuse at a certain point. making the shape, and that's why a baby's head could be manipulated early to alter its shape, but you can't increase the volume, and that's that's one of the puzzles. But that's one thing that Lloyd pointed out, is that I sent him photographs of many of these skulls, and with two of them, there seemed to be only a single parietal plate and a single frontal plate. And he said, "Can you see any kind of fine, fissure that would show signs of the suture?" And I practically stuck my eyeballs up against them, and there is no sign whatsoever. So there are skulls that only have two plates, meaning that as they grew, as the skull grew, it would have a different genetic blueprint or genetic formula to tell it what to do. And so that is the first characteristic that shows us that these aren't quote-unquote normal human beings.
So there might be a genetic difference here then, and hopefully this is something that might become clearer after more DNA testing is done on the skulls. Now, Brian, do you know how that goes and timelines on that? Because I know that it could be an excruciatingly long waiting period and time to get some of these tests done, right?
Yeah, well, according to Lloyd, I was talking to him yesterday, and he said the test will probably start in 2 weeks, and then he stated that it'll take approximately 3 weeks to get any kind of reasonable beginning results. But as you know, and as David and others would know, to do proper DNA testing is a very lengthy and exacting science. So it could take quite a long time, but I have told Lloyd, if you need more samples, I can get them, and I am getting access to other skulls as well. So like in any scientific pursuit, the more samples you have, the more you're able to create, a true scientific result at the end.
Absolutely. What are the samples from, by the way, and how did you get a hold of them? I don't know if that's David's job to do that, or was that your, Brian?
Well, that was the funny thing, is that the museums in Peru and probably around the world are very protective, of course, about their collection. So at the Ica Museum, which has 4 of these incredibly huge skulls on display, I was able to get in the back room, and they have at least 40 to 50 more of them sitting in dusty, cases. And I asked if I could, take one out and look, and it was strictly no, you're not allowed to. But
Right.
then Senior Juan Navarro, who owns the little museum in the village of Paracas, he had one on display. And so I simply asked him, I said, would it be possible for me to take samples? And he said, I have 15 more at home. So the next day he arrived with 3 skulls, and he allowed me to take hair samples. In some case there was still skin, so I was able to take skin samples, bone samples, and 1 tooth, in a total from 5 different skulls. And he's very open to have me take more samples if need be.
And the question here then obviously becomes, if this is a genetic mutation, if this is evidence of some kind of meddling in some way, or if it's simply because of, if you will, a medical condition. These might still be, naturally explained, if you will, for whatever reason, and that might be an unknown variable right now. I don't know how much you guys know about that, but we could also be looking at a situation then that these might have been, in one way or another, natural mutations taking place, but then these individuals have, because of this mutation and this deformation of the skull, maybe arisen to a different status within the society, the culture, the tribe. What do you think about that, David?
Well, sure, and I mean, this genetic testing will be interesting. Unfortunately, it could go on for a long time. I know that with Lloyd Pye, his genetic testing has apparently gone on for many years, and without any real conclusion, as far as I know. I mean, the thing that I find fascinating with it is that it was such a worldwide phenomenon. And when I wrote my book on the mystery of the Olmecs, throughout that book, I have to battle the mainstream scientists and archaeologists who also write on the Olmecs, and there's not very many of them, but they all maintain that the Olmecs were an American Indian tribe and they maintain all American Indians walked across the Bering Straits from Siberia some 10, 15,000 years ago, settled North and South America, and then the Olmecs suddenly sprung up, creating these giant, colossal heads, some of them weighing 20 tons. They're quite famous because they look like Africans, and even making those colossal heads would be quite a feat, because basalt is such a hard stone to work with. But one of the things that I point out in that book, the Olmecs were really famous for the cranial deformation, and what we do have with the Olmecs is a lot of statuary, ceramics and stone statuary depicting what these people look like. Even oftentimes they're holding babies in their hands or in a cradle. There's certain motifs particularly famous for the Olmecs. But what I found was that the mainstream archaeologists barely mention the cranial deformation, although with the Olmecs that's particularly famous. And as you go to the museum in Mexico City, there's a great Olmec museum in Jalapa, Mexico, near Veracruz. And as you look at all that statuary, the Olmecs, nearly all of them, had some kind of cranial deformation. But the mainstream archaeologists are basically ignoring this, and they hardly even discuss it. And what I surmise in my book, The Mystery of the Olmecs, is that they don't want to talk about cranial deformation because it was such a worldwide phenomenon and would basically indicate that the Olmecs, like other cultures, were in contact with other continents, transoceanic voyages across the Pacific and across the Atlantic. You have all the similarities between certain Egyptian pharaohs, particularly the Otanists of ancient Egypt, Akhenaten and Nefertiti, King Tut even, their daughters Meritaten and Meketaten, that they also have these elongated skulls. The Kurds in Iraq were doing this, and people were doing this right up until the 1940s and 50s. We have photos of people who are have their heads bound in Africa and Vanuatu, also in the Kurds. But the mainstream has decided, not to really look into this because it tends to draw connections to all these ancient civilizations, because cranial deformation and these elongated heads, it's a very unusual thing to do, yet it was done around the world, on literally every continent.
Absolutely, and we think at first when we scrape the surface, we see that this is a prominent tradition, if you will, then in many of the South American countries, or at that time regions. Obviously, the different cultures over there were doing it. Then when we begin to look a little bit closer, as you mentioned, David, we can see that it was practiced in Egypt. I personally have been really interested about all the deformed skulls that have been found on Malta.
Malta, that's right. Yeah, Malta also. And some of those skulls in Malta, like Brian was saying, are unusual in that they appear not to have the normal plates in the head that we would expect to see. And so it has also been surmised, as Brian is saying, about some of these Paracas and Ica skulls, that, even though they're elongated and obviously deformed, but that those skulls may not be the result of some kind of artificial head binding, but these people actually looked like that.
It's very, very strange when you think about it. And then, if we look further, there is stories, at least at this point. I don't know if there's been any finds, but different East Germanic tribes were apparently into this, particular tradition, or whatever you want to call it, as well. How far up did it go? Do you think, David? Are we do you know about stories further up in Northern Europe, maybe stretching into Asia as well?
Yeah, sure. And in fact, if you, in my sort of recent studies on this, I found that, as you go into actually Siberia, Mongolia, and ancient China, these guys are also depicted with these weird elongated skulls. And in fact, there's many, these are mainly paintings actually, we have of these Taoist and Confucianist masters supposedly, and they have also these elongated skulls and sometimes squared off. I mean, they're obviously deformed. They look very much like the Inca skulls, and particularly with the Chinese skulls and some of the Olmec skulls, there's a strange cleft in the top of the skull, and we call this the W formation. Sometimes they call them the pumpkin heads or something, where you not only have this elongated skull, but then at the top is this indent, so that a person's skull, in a sense, looks like an M or a W kind of feature. And particularly with these ancient Chinese skulls, that's very pronounced. Another thing that goes along with all this skull deformation as a worldwide thing, and something that's still popular today, it's had a huge resurgence, is this other types of body manipulation and mutilation, wearing all kinds of tattoos, of scarring, of even changing the face and the teeth, creating some kind of almost werewolf face or something like that. All the piercings that are popular today, and of course tattooing and whatnot. And that's something, too, that ancient people did a lot of. And it's sort of like, well, there's nothing new under the sun. If you're walking down the street in some western city and you see some guy full of tattoos and body piercings and his tongue and nose are pierced and all kinds of other weird stuff. And actually, ancient people looked a lot like that, too.
We just have the manipulation of the skull. That's just the next step from this, then, I guess.
That's right. We're not doing that because that has to be done to babies. And it's, we don't allow people to actually do this to their children. And you're not really allowed, I think, to go out and have your babies tattooed and cranially deformed and stuff. But in ancient times, they definitely did that.
They sure did. That's right. Brian, what does the Inca? I mean, you've researched the Inca culture, had that as a focus in a lot of your work, obviously, in the books you've written and so forth as well. Do they tell anything specific about these skulls, or maybe the reasons behind them? Was this trait of aristocracy that we kind of alluded to earlier?
Definitely. It seems that it was solely the priestly, kingly class that had this done. And recently I was in the Paracas area, and thanks to Senior Juan Navarro, who's made me his assistant museum director at the little Paracas History Museum, we went to 2 graveyard sites, ancient ones, where he said the elongated skulls were grave robbers in general are the ones who find them. So we went to these 2 sites, and I found actually part of a skull that David is describing. It's the domed kind, or not domed, it's like the M-shaped skull. And I pointed that out to Senior Juan. But the thing is, if unfortunately, the only real records written that we have of the Inca were in general written by the Spanish.
That's right.
After 1533. But we do have Garcilaso de la Vega, who was part or half Inca. And the more that you explore the chronicles, you get little hints here and there. One thing that most people don't realize is that the Inca had either very shortly cropped hair or they were bald. Because all the paintings, that are famous, which were done by the Spanish, show them with long black hair and that sort of thing, which is completely untrue. So what I'm theorizing, and others are theorizing, is that the very short hair or even the bald hair or bald head was done in order to show the fact that their skulls were slightly different in shape than, or maybe even greatly. And since none of the Inca mummies has ever been found, of the great high Incas. They were either destroyed by the Spanish or were secreted away by the royal family before the Spanish could get at them. We don't honestly know what the Inca physically looked like, but what we do know is that the Inca were a family of people and in general very small in number. So
Yeah,
sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, definitely. I want to ask you a little bit about what you think, Brian, about some of these different shaped skulls. Then, if we look at the different styles of the head shaping that has taken place, there's images on the web, obviously, from the Paracas culture that can be seen in the National Museum, I think it is, of Peru. And there is on display 6 different kinds. Maybe there's more, I don't know. But some of them, obviously, as you described before, David, they're kind of bulged out at the back. Some are just kind of straight, elongated. Other ones seems to be more volume, if you will. Maybe there's a difference here then in what they did. Maybe this was again a trait of the person, if you will, in that sense. What do you think, Brian? Why the difference, if I put it that way?
Well, at least in Peru, it seems that there are 3 distinct kinds that you can find. One is the classic, which if you put elongated skull into a search engine, you automatically get photographs of the 4 famous ones that are at the Ica Museum, and those are the huge ones that theoretically have twice the cranial volume as a normal human being. And then you have smaller ones which are elongated, and I suspect those are the ones which have been manipulated. It's almost as though the ancient natural race of people who were small in number died out, and so after that there was a copying process where the people desperately wanted these ancient, kingly, priestly class to come back, so they copied them. And then you have what David calls is the M shape, and I've seen a few of those, but they definitely look like that was something which was manipulated.
And is there a possibility that these have been, I don't know, medical procedures in some way? That this is evidence of, if you will, and in one sense, technology or medicine in that sense?
Well, the thing is that you tend to find a lot of trepanation, which is where they did skull surgery at the same time as the same areas where you find the elongated skulls. And some people have speculated that, of course, there would be that as the result of injuries from warfare or whatever. But in other cases, it seems that the surgeons were going after the pineal gland for some reason. The pineal supposedly being related to psychic ability, and it's just my speculation that again, once the natural elongated heads died out, there was this desperate attempt to bring back not only the shape, but perhaps the psychic ability that these people had by going in through surgery and manipulating the pineal gland to make it grow, possibly.
Interesting.
Yeah.
David, do you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting. And I mean, that's certainly one idea. You have the idea that by doubling the cranial capacity, that people's psychic powers and the third eye and the pineal gland and whatnot are somehow more active, have some stronger force. The other theory of the tree panning, and I think a more standard one, is that if you've gone through this cranial deformation, and it's going to happen to you as a very young baby, you're not even going to remember it. And one day you get up and you look in the mirror, and then you've got this long head. I mean, this is what you look like. Your own family, they all look like that too. But they think that what may happen in some cases with this cranial deformation is that there are some problems associated with it, and that these people may experience really severe headaches, perhaps. Other, in a sense, maybe they have, which may be unrelated to cranial deformation, but they have, just mental problems, whatever's going on. And that therefore these surgeons are then trying to relieve this pressure on their head, They've got these terrible headaches, shall we say? I mean, this is just a theory.
Yeah.
And so by doing the trepanation, which is basically cutting a hole in your head, and that, so in a more primitive sense, it's sort of like, well, if we cut a hole in your big cone head, we'll let the evil spirits out of your head or something, and you won't, all these voices you're hearing or these terrible headaches you're getting will disappear. I mean, this is one idea, and that would be a lot more primitive sort of concept, and that's part of what we have in, particularly in South America, where you have the kind of extremes of relatively primitive cultures living and literally in the Stone Age, as many Amazon Indians live. Well, at the same time, you have evidence that Tiwanaku and Pumapunku, also the giant ruins around Cuzco and in Cuzco, for that matter, Ollantaytambo, even Machu Picchu, where you have really advanced stonework, and even there's evidence of machining being used, giant saws, what we would call power tools, drilling. I was just recently at Tiwanaku and around Cuzco with Christopher Dunn, the British American engineer who's written the Giza power plant and his new book about ancient technology, advanced lost technologies of ancient Egypt. And he's confirmed that, yeah, there's evidence, particularly at Tiwanaku and Ollantaytambo, of some kind of power tools being used. So here you have evidence of what would be an extremely advanced ancient society doing things that even we would have difficulty doing today.
Absolutely. And Brian, I don't know if there's any evidence for other, features, basically physical features as a side effect of the skull being manipulated in one way. I mean, we don't know, as far as I know, that much about the tissue, even if the brain actually were prone to grow bigger, because, if there's more room in the skull, in that sense, you might actually get an enlarged brain as well. But have you heard anything like that, Brian?
Well, unfortunately, because these skulls are at least 2,000, if not 3,000 years old, there's never been one that contains much, if any, brain material. What makes sense is that the ones which were manipulated, it's almost like the analogy I give is, it's like if you have a greenware pot that you have on a potter's wheel, you're able to change the shape of it because the clay is still wet, but you can't make it grow. And that's the main thing that distinguishes the very elongated ones at Ica and Paracas with many of the others in the world. But yeah, at this point, that's pure. It would be pure speculation on my part to say any more. But what David does say, has said, is very important, because it's the area of Cusco, the area of Tiwanaku, and the coast area, which is right in between them, which is where we find a lot of the cranial manipulation and elongated heads in the Peru-Bolivia area. And at least Cusco and the Sacred Valley, which is next to it, and Tiwanaku, Pumapunku, is where we find, as David said, and as Chris has shown, incredibly advanced technology, and not just one time period. It seems that there were at least two cultures that came before the Inca, thousands of years before, which were able to build the megalithic masterpieces, which, again, if you read the chronicles, the Inca themselves say they did not make.
That's
but
right.
In modern day tourism in Cusco, everything is Inca according to the tour guides, which is completely false. And that's why I set up my tour business, because I started to get offended by this constant, the Inca built this, the Inca built that. When the more you look at the physical evidence, and having someone like Chris Dunn and David Hatcher Childress there to witness, it's obvious that there were at least three cultures, the Inca being the last and probably not the most powerful in that area.
Yeah. So I've always been fascinated by this because that means that we have a culture that grew large, if you will, the Incan Empire, that basically just moved in, as far as I understood the situation, to where these incredible monuments were, the pyramids and so forth as well. What happened there in that sense? And have you, Brian, gotten any closer to the answer of who actually built many of these monuments then?
Well, unfortunately, we don't have proper names for the people, but that's kind of typical of the area. For example, some of the listeners might have heard of the Chachapoyas culture. They were supposedly a very light-skinned, possibly blonde hair or red-haired people with light-colored eyes. But their name, Chachapoyas, was given to them by the Inca, and they only disappeared about 500 years ago. So we know very little about them. Going back several thousands of years, what seems to have happened was clearly there was a great earth cataclysm, supposedly in the nature of 11,000, 12,000 years ago, that caused, devastation around the planet. And I believe, and others believe, that what we're seeing in terms of the old vestiges or the old beautiful, perfectly built structures are those that were made by master engineers and builders, and they were able to build them to withstand, huge earthquakes. So that's probably why they're still standing, is that even if the earth was perhaps hammered by a meteor or something 12,000 years ago, these structures still remain. But unfortunately, we're still researching, and I'm avidly trying to find old Quechua, which is the native language of the Inca speakers, to be able to teach me and others the oral traditions.
How much, I want to ask you obviously about this as well, David, but before we do that, how much have you been able to find in terms of the oral tradition then? Because again, unfortunately, as far as we know, much of this is not written down. We have symbols on some of the monuments here and there, of course, that reveals somewhat of the information. But is there still an oral tradition, as far as you know, Brian, out there?
Well, it's very difficult, and it's actually much more difficult than most people would know. The fact is, the Spanish were ruthless when they came here. And the first thing they did was eradicate the belief system by destroying as best they could, the old religion.
Yeah.
And that, an obvious example is the Coricancho, which was the spiritual center of the entire Inca civilization. That was the first building that the Spanish immediately went into and destroyed down to the ground, the Temple of the Sun. They of course stole the gold, but they physically removed every single stone so that wouldn't exist. And on top of that, they built a huge church. And that's happened again worldwide, especially in Europe, where
yes,
it's a great technique of colonization, that the first thing you do is you build your religious structure on top of an existing one, and in that way, the people of the area will still go there out of reverence for the site.
I want to focus a little bit more on that after that as well. But David, I want to ask you about what you speculate in terms of origins of some of the builders and so forth. You've both written and obviously theorized quite a bit of this. Would you attribute the majority of this back to the Olmecs, or do we need to go further? What do you think?
Well, there's an interesting clue actually to the origins of the Incas and of the builders of Tiwanaku. Which was before the Incas, and by the way, I want to say that Brian, the Spanish weren't able to totally dismantle the Coricancha Sun Temple. I mean, they did rebuild it into a church, which you see today, but many of the original walls are still standing on the inside and outside. So the Spanish weren't even able, if they, even though they tried, to totally dismantle that structure. I mean, that was part of the thing. A lot of these megalithic structures, particularly the ones around Cusco, I mean, they're so well built and interconnected that they can't even really be destroyed. But here's the interesting thing there too, and this is in the spring issue of our magazine World Explorer, and just when we were there in January and February with Christopher Dunn, was there's something new going on in Bolivia, and that is that there's a new museum in La Paz, and in that museum this archaeological museum there in the old town of La Paz, is this strange ceramic bowl, and that is called the Fuente Magna bowl. And it was discovered near Tiwanaku around 1960 and was kept in a private collection. It was then given, in a sense, to the Bolivian government, who did not put it on display until just about 2 years ago. And what's astonishing with this ceramic bowl is that it has two different kinds of strange writing. One is Sumerian cuneiform, and so Sumerian writing is on that bowl. And then there's also a strange hieroglyphic language there. Now this is very significant because, first of all, mainstream archaeologists say that there was never any kind of writing in South America. And yet now we have, in a government museum in La Paz, we have a bowl with Sumerian writing. There's also a statue that was found near Tiwanaku too, and it also has Sumerian cuneiform writing on it, and that's a granite statue. And photos of these, and even some translations from Sumerian scholars are in the issue of the magazine of World Explorer. And here's the other interesting thing, is that in ancient Sumerian, which is a very unusual language, and in fact they say that Sumerian is a unique language because it's not related to any other language. Most ancient languages are related somehow in different ways to each other, or at least to some other language, but they can't find that with Sumerian. In Sumerian, the term Inca means great lord. So this may actually be the origin of the term Inca, a term that would have been used for thousands of years in the Andes, coming from ancient Sumeria, and that all of the lords, the aristocrats, the rulers were called Incas as a Sumerian word. And now what they're thinking is that there is one language in the world that is related to ancient Sumerian, and it's the Aymara language of the southern area of Lake Titicaca and Tiwanaku and around La Paz and that area. So suddenly we have this Sumerian South American connection, and in fact it would appear to be that if the Sumerians were somehow connected with the building of Tiwanaku, and we're talking some high-tech quarrying and building, that at least they were somehow there at that time. And if they weren't the builders of that ancient city, then they were somehow with those builders and even giving their language to that area. So how about that?
Right. Well, that's really interesting. The Fuente Magna, this bowl, could that might have been a gift maybe between the cultures? Again, we might be seeing the early days of trading happening right there between the continents, David. What do you think?
Well, right, and this is all diffusionism, transatlantic, trans-Pacific voyaging around the world. I've written in my books about ancient vimanas and airships. Just like today, we've got aircraft and airships, we've got spaceships and stuff like that. And, of course, we still have lots of big boats and ships, from giant oil tankers to private yachts and things like that. And apparently, I mean, in ancient times, people were voyaging around the world in boats, crossing oceans. Oceans are highways, not barriers, as some archaeologists try to tell us. I mean, the easy way to go from place to place is not to walk everywhere, but is actually to get into a boat and go along the coastal areas or just cross an ocean, go in the currents. We know ancient people did that. The Polynesians managed to settle remote islands like Hawaii and Easter Island exactly that way. There's no reason why they wouldn't have actually made it all the way to North or South America And in fact, it would seem unusual if they did. And that's where we have to focus again on the mystery of Easter Island and all those giant statues there. They're also coneheads. Those statues are people with cranial deformation as well.
About that. It's very interesting hearing about this, the communication of what's happening between the different cultures, and we hear, as you say, David, always a no-no on that, although we have people like Tor Heyerdahl that we previously talked with you about, obviously, David, as well. Brian, what do you make of that, the example of this bowl that's been found here close to the shores of Lake Titicaca and finding kind of a proto-cuneiform or Sumerian language on that?
Oh, I think it's, very, very plausible, including, there have been a number of artifacts supposedly found in Ecuador which have proto, the same kind of language on them. And that, the diffusionism so-called theory, I completely go along with, which is what David believes in, and other people like Stephen Mailer believe in. And even in terms of if you start to look at the relationship of the different places you find the elongated heads, for example, with the Egyptians during the period of Akhenaten, the Amarna, and then there was a group in Sudan, just below that, which also had cranial elongation, and they migrated to the west coast of Africa. So again, they moved to the coast. The Egyptians were close, or basically on the Mediterranean. Malta is in the Mediterranean. And the oral traditions of the people of Vanuatu state that their ancestors came from Egypt via the Red Sea. So, and if you go to South America, you're talking about the fact that the natural currents of that part of the Pacific, if you're like Tor Heyerdahl on the Kon-Tiki or on any kind of boat, even without a sail, you will naturally travel towards the area of Easter Island. So it's not simply plausible; it's probable that these people were traveling and either interbreeding and or sharing characteristics and belief systems thousands of years before we give them credit.
That's right, and the difficulty from our point of view, obviously, is to pin down the exact timeline on this. When did this happen? Is it one people or actually traveling, moving, if you will, in that sense, kind of like a nomad tribe, and maybe, as you said, Brian, teaching other people, intermarrying, what have you. So it might be that the culture is spreading around, but in some cases, the evidence seems to suggest that we have, writing and so forth is springing up on the continents, different continents, approximately at the same time. But again, it's very difficult for us to dig into the earth and say exactly when this took place, in that sense. But both of you, obviously, you're writing a book together on this subject of the elongated skulls and cranial deformation as well. Tell us a bit about the ETA, I guess, on this and when you expect this to come out. Brian, and why don't you begin, and we'll ask David later more.
Okay, well, David and I have decided to divide it up into a number of chapters, and then I am to write certain chapters, he will write other chapters, and then we'll, basically compare notes and put the book together that way. And I believe David's been talking about a timeline of around October, which I'm in complete, comfortable agreement with.
Excellent. So we obviously be able to read more about this and some of the research, and at that point, hopefully as well, even more about the DNA will be gathered, and there's a lot of data, I reckon, at this point is waiting to go into the book. David, tell us a little bit about your part of the book project.
Well, right. I've been fascinated with cranial deformation, the cone heads, for a long time, and being in Malta and whatnot. It's about time for a book like this to come out. With the Olmecs and cranial deformation, so much of what's going on, even at Tiwanaku, where you have these fabulous sites and unusual things, and the entire museums even devoted to them, yet very little has really been written on these subjects. And as I was saying earlier, the mainstream archaeologists and scholars tend to steer away from this subject, particularly cranial deformation, because they're these isolationists. What we've got now aside from the, such people like Thor Heyerdahl, who was, an important pioneer in all this, but most of the university scholars, at least in Europe and North America, they maintain that ancient cultures were isolated from each other. They had very little or no contact at all. And certainly people weren't traveling by ship or by air, for that matter, from continent to continent, from Asia across the Pacific to South America, or from Africa and the Mediterranean across the Atlantic. I mean, this is their dogma. People didn't go places. They were isolated from each other. And yet, things like cranial deformation, these ancient scripts being found in various places, like the Sumerian script at Tiwanaku. Yeah, I mean, this is the kind of evidence that totally refutes the academic dogma that's still being taught in universities around the world. And I mean, these people are supposedly the scholars and experts on this subject, yet when they're shown this, it seems to be incontrovertible evidence, I mean, they just have to deny it. And in fact, you have to wonder what they would say about the Fuente Magna bowl there in La Paz. They would have to say it's a hoax, and that some hoaxer in Bolivia has decided to create this elaborate hoax. Yet it's, the Bolivian archaeologists themselves are totally positive that the Fuente Magna bowl is completely genuine. And yet, in a sense, it's going to change history, and the whole thing of these coneheads around the world does much the same.
Very interesting. We definitely need to spend some time here now talking a little bit about the ancient Peru Grand Tour that both of you are participating in together with Hugh Newman from Megalithomania as well, coming up in November here this year, 2011, the 10th to the 20th, and it's a huge thing, obviously, a big tour that both of you guys, or all three of you, are doing of these various sites around in Peru and Bolivia, and it looks really exciting. And why don't we begin to talk a little bit with you, Brian, about the tour? You're obviously accustomed to doing this. You've been doing the Inca tours for quite a while as well. What can you say about this upcoming event, Brian?
Well, basically, we're going to cover all of the major megalithic sites, as well as some which are not as well known. And included in the list over that time period will be Tiwanaku, Pumapunku, the Island of the Sun in Lake Titicaca, Silistani, which is not that well known but is phenomenal, as well as Amarumuru, which is the so-called Stargate, which is near Lake Titicaca. And then we'll be traveling by bus on the Royal Inca Road, connecting Lake Titicaca with Cusco. And at Cusco, of course, we'll be going to Machu Picchu, Ollantaytambo, all of the sites within Cusco itself, and Sacsayhuaman, with an emphasis on really looking at the structures and discussing the different time periods under which they were built, because Machu Picchu is usually talked about as having been built by one Inca called Pachacutec about 500 years ago or less. But we, and David as well, has seen this, and it's on one of his DVDs with Chris Dunn, is that we can clearly see three different time periods of construction going back several thousand years. The most famous one is the Intihuatana, which is called the Hitching Post of the Sun, and that one is clearly thousands of years older than the Inca civilization.
It looks like a tremendous opportunity for those who will be able to go on this, obviously, as well. It's so many exciting places and sites, obviously, to see. Tiwanaku, Punco, and then obviously going to Cusco and so forth as well. David, what can you say about the tour? What are you looking forward to the most, I guess?
Oh, I always love going to Peru and Bolivia and just South America in general. It's just a fantastic land of mystery and adventure. My company is called Adventures Unlimited, and Peru and Bolivia are exactly that. It's just so fantastic down there. So I'll be flying down to Lima with the group, meeting them there. Brian's already there. Hugh Newman from Megalithomania will be coming along, and then we'll be flying to Lake Titicaca. We'll be going to Tiwanaku early on in the trip. We'll be going to the museum in La Paz to see the Fuente Magna bowl and spending time looking around Pumapunku. And then just the megalithic sites all through all that area, culminating with Sacsayhuaman and Ollantay Tambo and Machu Picchu. It's just something that everybody should see. And I mean, I've been down there a dozen times, and I never get tired of it. I can't wait for this trip. It'll be great.
Yeah, that's right. And then there's an extension as well to this. You're going to go and see the Nazca lines as well, right?
Yeah, that's right. I think that is an extension, and we would do that at the end of the trip when we return to Lima, and then we'll go by bus south down the coast. And we would actually be visiting Ica and Paracas as well. So Brian hopefully will give us a personal tour of some of these private museums, and we'll see some of these unusual conehead skulls, right up close, and you get to see them for yourself. And I mean, they're astonishing in themselves right there.
Absolutely excellent. I want to give out the website for that as well, so people can obviously read more about this, check out some of the sites there, and all the details are obviously collected on one page. You guys can go to megalithomania.co.uk and then /Peru 2011.html, and obviously I will link this up on redicecreations.com as well, so you can click through and check out the tour. I mean, this would be a once in a lifetime, obviously experience of going there, checking out some of these areas and seeing it for yourself, and obviously have a great three great tour guides with you as well in the process as well. So before we wrap things up for this time, we want to ask you to give out your websites and stuff like that as well, guys, so people know where to go to find out more about your work individually. Brian, why don't we begin with you? You have the Inca tours, obviously, that you're doing on the side of this as well. You have a couple of books out there as well. Tell us about your websites and your books as well.
Yeah, my website is hiddenincatours.com.
Hidden Inca Tours. And tell us about some of the book titles you have out there.
Okay, well, I've got actually 4 books out right now. I'm just finishing off a 5th one. My first book is A Brief History of the Incas, which is in print and also available as an ebook. And David's Adventures Unlimited Press is the only distributor in the world for that in the print version. So any inquiries about the actual print book goes through Adventures Unlimited Press. And then the other books are available as ebooks through Amazon. I've got one about the ancient history of Hawaii. And then I have another one which is a companion book for people who wish to travel around Cusco and the Sacred Valley and look at the megalithic structures from the viewpoint that David and I have been, explaining. And then I have one very small book solely about Machu Picchu, again explaining it from the viewpoint of it having been built over 3 different time periods. And the book I'm working on right now, which should be, I'll have the first version of it finished within a few days, is called The Inca Before the Conquest, and it will cover the period of the Inca from their origins up until the arrival of the Spanish. And what I want to do with that one is basically explain how, in a detailed manner, the Inca expanded their civilization from first arriving in Cusco up until the day when the Spanish arrived, but including nothing of the Spanish.
I see. And then you've been featured. That's still upcoming, I think, though. The Ancient Aliens, the TV series. You've been filming for that, right?
Oh, that's right. I'm in 4 episodes of season 3 of Ancient Aliens. I believe the first episode is July 28th, and there are 16 episodes in total. I'm in 4, and David is in at least 1. I'm not sure how many more he's in. And then I do have a tour coming up in Egypt in January with Antoine Chagall and Jan-Pieter de Jong. And what we're going to be doing is comparing the megalithic structures of Peru with those of Egypt in order to see if we can find evidence of the global diffusionist culture that David's been speaking about.
Very, very interesting. Again, then, for more information about Brian's work, go to hiddenincatours.com. We will link that up as well. David, I will ask you to do the same as well, of course. Talk a little bit about some of the books you have out there and your websites as well, of course.
Right. I've started my own publishing company back in the 1980s, and I'm the author myself of over 20 books, and we've published nearly 300 over the last 25 years. And that's our Adventures Unlimited Press. We have a website called adventuresunlimitedpress.com. You can see a lot of our publications and DVDs, as Brian's book and Christopher Dunn's and many others, and Graham Hancock and Robert Bivall and all kinds of people. I'm, well known really for my archaeological books. I did a whole series of books called Lost Cities of South America, one of North and Central America, one of Africa and Arabia, one on China, Central Asia, and India, one on Europe and the Mediterranean, and one all about Pacific islands. And in those books, I look at all the different mysteries, megalithic cultures, diffusionism, because even stories of giants and lost treasures, sunken ruins have always been interesting to me. I'm a big believer, actually, in ancient civilizations going back 10, 20, 30,000 years, and including Atlantis and things like that. And I've well known recently for a book, actually, which I wrote about 10 years ago, The Technology of the Gods, and I did a Red Ice interview on that one, as you mentioned earlier.
Absolutely.
My last book, actually, which was about a year ago or so, was a little bit of a departure from me. It was a cryptozoology book on called Yetis, Sasquatch, and Hairy Giants. And in fact, that book's been published in Kathmandu as well. And nearly every year I go to the Himalayas, often to Nepal or Sikkim or places like that. And I've always been fascinated with Yetis and Sasquatch. So that book is out now, and that has a color photo section as well. And I did the Olmec book a few years ago. But I continue to travel all over the world. I love going to all these places. I'm planning in September to go to Bosnia and to a conference there and check out this Great Pyramid of Bosnia.
That's
suppose
right.
You've talked about that on Red Ice as well.
Absolutely. That's a really, really interesting one. And is that the first time you're heading over there then, David?
Yeah, this will be the first time.
Yeah.
And I'll plan to do probably just an article for our magazine, World Explorer, which is all about mysteries, archaeological and cryptozoology around the world. And we have a separate website for our magazine. It's called the World Explorers Club, and our website for that is wexclub.com, WEX club.com. So I hope people will check that out.